Hi everyone, I hope you're well. Today we're looking at a new budget handheld available from Powkiddy, the X51. The X51, from both an internal and firmware perspective, shares a lot with their previous budget model, the X39. The Powkiddy X51 has the exact same CPU as the X39, which is the ATM 7051. Both models have 128 megs of RAM, as well as sharing the same firmware. The X51 does have a slightly bigger screen at a 5-inch IPS panel at a 800 by 480 resolution compared to the X39's 4.3-inch IPS screen, which has the lower resolution at 480 by 272. Both models are available around the $55 mark, so consider this a entry-level retro handheld. Personally happy to see competition at the lower end, as we've seen a lot of activity around the much higher end recently. Design-wise, I actually quite like the shell design of the X51, though really dislike the Joy-Con style they've applied to each end. From my point of view, the X51 just would have looked so much better in a solid colour option. But overall, the quality is actually pretty good, especially for the lower end, with the handheld coming in surprisingly weighty at around 210 grams and a very nice sized screen and sensible button placement. The joysticks don't press in, which is a bit jarring at first, as it's so similar to the Switch analog joysticks otherwise that my gaming muscle memory is convinced that these style of joysticks should press in. But ultimately, the L3 and R3 buttons would be next to useless in the games that this handheld's best at emulating anyway. The buttons actually feel quite good on the X51, with a comfortable amount of travel and response. The joysticks are both good overall, with passable amounts of travel and input response, though the right analog is confusingly mapped to act as an alternative for the front buttons on most emulators. So if you press the right analog stick to the left, for example, it will be treated as if you press the Y button. This is even the case within the firmware itself, which has caused me all sorts of confusion. The stacked shoulder buttons feel quite nice to press too, though very much like the X39 before it, they can't actually be mapped within the firmware itself. So despite them being pretty decent as buttons, you'll only be using them in a couple of emulators. The D-pad is the only real disappointment when it comes to the X51's controls. That's not to say it's terrible, as I've seen a lot worse on lower end handhelds, but considering the rest of the control setup is actually quite good, the D-pad just doesn't feel like it measures up to the same standard, being very stiff to operate, difficult to pull off multi-directional inputs successfully, and pretty slow in response. It's workable in the majority of genres, admittedly, but just doesn't translate well to anything that needs precise inputs, like fighters or some of the less forgiving platformers. The firmware on the X51 is identical to the X39, so unfortunately all the negatives that we mentioned in the X39 review are also present and accounted for here. These include, but not limited to, the issue whereby the search doesn't work correctly, the lack of mappable shoulder buttons, all of the USB controllers not registering correctly, and the HDMI out not working with audio. Most importantly, the same unreliable emulation performance still exists, which is a massive shame, as this range of budget handheld could be something very special if these bugs were just addressed and fixed. Having a budget handheld that could support all of these various emulators, while also supporting additional controller support and HDMI out, would be something very special indeed, but until these features are actually working, it's more than an irritant than anything else. In some ways, it's actually more annoying to have the features there but not working properly than to not have them there at all, but that's the situation we're in, unfortunately. The saving graces the firmware has for it is that it's very easy to navigate, defaults to English and saves its language settings. It's easy to add new ROMs to, which with it effectively just being a drag and drop exercise, with an option to recall the various subfolders on the SD card available in the main menu. Save states are supported, though cheats are not, and you're able to change the screen ratio from full screen to the emulator's default scaling. This is a very neat feature, and thank goodness it's actually here, as the scaling is actually incorrect on the PS1 emulator by default. So you need to make sure that you go in and set that to full screen to actually make the PlayStation 1 games playable at all. So with all that said, I'll cut to some emulation gameplay now and summarise back up at the end. So all in all, I actually prefer the X51 over the X39. For an entry-level budget handheld, it's got pretty good controls, though a slightly annoying D-pad, some good hardware features, although not all of them work as intended, and unfortunately is mostly let down by its firmware and unreliable emulation support. I've experienced a few freezes while playing 3D PlayStation 1 games and had some form of frame skipping on most Super Nintendo games, which are the main things stopping me from recommending it as the go-to budget handheld right now. Now, no one, Powkiddy especially, shouldn't expect the community to make custom firmware just to address shortcomings of handhelds they release. But if there's ever a future where the X39 or X51 does get custom firmware support by the community, then the X51 could well evolve into one of the best budget handhelds available. As it is though, the X51 is a good budget-friendly entry into retro gaming handheld, but does have some glaring shortcomings that you should be made aware of before purchasing to avoid any disappointment. So that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching.